Hello, my name is Kaya Sprindescu, and today I'll present to you our paper, which are struggle in Sensemaking, where we look at a field study of merge conflict resolution behavior. This is work that was done while I was a graduate student at Oregon State University with Jennifer Ramirez, and I was under the supervision of Anita Sarma and Carlos Jensen. So we know that collaboration drives software development. All of today's software is developed in a collaborative environment, be it if it's proprietary or if it's open source software. And when you have that collaboration, you do have the occasional two changes to the same file to the same line. This is when a merge conflict occurs, when two developers make concurrent changes. And when that happens, the developer has to interrupt their work and focus on solving it before they can move on. Right? Research has shown, both ours and also related work has shown that about 1 in 5, that's 20% of all merge conflicts, result in a conflict. So of course we try to understand what makes merge conflict resolution for developers. And in order to answer those, we proposed two research questions. The first one is, what types of information do software developers seek when resolving merge conflicts, and how do they synthesize information to resolve that merge conflict? So, as the title suggests, we conduct an observational study of real developers working on production code. We are lucky enough to have a software development kind of enterprise within Oregon State University, and I was able to go there for 2 weeks and camp out. And when they had a merge conflict, I'll go in with a GoPro and kind of record their voice on their screen while they were resolving. And I was able to collect 96 minutes of merge conflict resolution. And that included 7 developers resolving 10 instances of merge conflicts overall. And first, let's kind of look at what kind of information sources developers use when resolving a merge conflict. So we see that they use a really wide variety of information source types, right? They look at the code difference, they look at the history, they look at the code itself. They run the code and look at its output or inspect its behavior. They run the test and the build system. They look at documentation. And also, as we've seen, sometimes they ask their own colleagues for help. So looking at RQ1, the first research question looks at how developers kind of pack and how they access this information. So the first one, we look at how many information sources do they actually use in one sitting, and we found two instances, right? The first are dense information source packing, where participants use more than 3 information sources, and then we have sparse, where they use fewer. The majority of the conflicts use the sparse information packing, or they use 3 or fewer information sources. However, our 4 longest one all use the dense information source packing. So now that we know that they do actually require, 40% of the cases, they did require to use a lot of information sources, the question is, how do they access it? Do they just kind of move from one to the other, or do they constantly have to switch in order to find out the information they need and kind of piece it together? And what we found is that while sequential is the most common one, we also found a significant number of developers that used interleaved, right? So switch between the code and the diff, or the code and the history, and the code and the documentation, because they needed to kind of piece together that information, and they weren't able to find what they were looking for. So kind of looking overall, and this is kind of a table that has that information across our whole data set, you can see that there is no correlation between sparse information packing and sequential, between information packing, information usage pattern, right? You can use sparse, you can use really few information sources but keep switching between them, or you can use a lot of them and still use them in a relatively linear way. So there is actually no correlation between the two, and these are in fact independent measures. So now, moving on to the second research question is how do they synthesize the information, right? Now we know how they access it. How do they synthesize? And in order to solve that, we basically went and looked what's called a Sensemaking. Sensemaking is a well-known framework for observing developer behavior and how they make sense of the problem. It has been successfully used in a lot of programming challenges, including debugging. So we adapted this framework, and I'm going to show you how this framework is applied in one of the instances of a conflict. So this is what, after an analysis, this is what a graph looks like. And this looks really complicated, but it has 3 dimensions, right? It presents 3 types of information. On the y-axis, we have the steps of our model, right? We have the external data sources, where they kind of look at what information is available, shoebox, where they select an information, source, evidence file, where they look for evidence in that particular artifact, hypothesis with the form of hypothesis, presentation, where they actually resolve and then evaluate if they need to go back and evaluate their solution, on the x-axis, we have the time in seconds, and of course color code, we have the artifact, which is the ones I showed, code history and so on. So looking at this particular conflict resolution, let's kind of break it down and see what we have. So zooming in, I'm going to use this orange triangle to highlight the areas of interest. Here we see what we called really quick resolutions, right? We call this a quick resolution because in the beginning they seem to be resolving. They go from the lower stages, such as shoebox or evidence file, they go to the presentation really quickly, right, in really few steps. And you see that in some cases they skip steps, and one of the more common steps that we've seen skipped on the web is called hypothesis, right? So this is our second pattern that was in, is where they skip the hypothesis because they already have the context that's needed and they know what they were doing, so we don't observe them from the hypothesis. Now moving on, we can see that here they are stuck, right? So here, for example, they are stuck in the evidence file, and they kind of go back to the shoebox and they kind of switch artifacts. But in this case, we see that they are stuck gathering information, right? Here they are stuck foraging, and they don't actually progress for a good chunk of time, as they're trying to find out the information, trying to find out what changed, why is this conflict occurring, how should they move forward. And they do have a few breakthroughs, but overall they are stuck. But after they get that information, we can see that again, they do a lot of quick resolutions, a lot of skipping the hypothesis, because now they have a lot of the information needed in order to resolve the conflict, so they can make progress. And of course, the second one is, again, they're stuck, but you can also see that in the middle where they're switching between the evidence file and the hypothesis formation, right? They're basically hunting for data. They kind of form a hypothesis, say, oh, I think this is what's going on. Then they go back, get more information, they revise the hypothesis, they get more information, and so on. And then again, they're also stuck, getting more information as well, right? In this pattern, there's also stuck. And you can see that they go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different information source types in order to get that resolution. And once they have that, once they kind of figure out, they're able to actually make progress, form the hypothesis. Again, here we can see they're kind of stuck in this, at the hypothesis level. They kind of go back and forth trying to get the information until they come up with the right solution. And in this particular case, the conflict was generated by something as simple as a different version of TypeScript, but it took them, almost 1500 seconds for them to kind of realize the cause and fix the conflict. So with this in mind, kind of summarize the 4 patterns we identified in our data set. So we have stuck foraging, which has 13 instances. We have hunting for data, like I said, when they are in the hypothesis or presentation phase, and they kind of have to go back as they're building the solution to get more information, right? They kind of keep hunting. We have quick resolution, which is easy. It's a really easy, trivial conflict, like formatting or just something that's really easy to tell. And there's also skipping the hypothesis, right, where the resolution happens fast because they have that context, right, and because they know exactly what's happening in the project. And we can see that's actually not very frequent. So to kind of put together what we've seen is that we've seen that finding the right information is difficult, and putting it into the right context is actually in a way even more difficult. And even when they knew what the changes were about, we saw instances where the merge conflict resolution was incomplete. And this is like a novel result, because no one in literature has anybody ever spoken about incomplete merge conflict resolutions. So here's the code. And basically what happens is that they decided, resolving this conflict is too difficult. I'm going to make a breaking change. I'm going to make this API throw an exception so that anybody who uses it will have to know that, okay, you can't use this. And then the developer that wrote the code initially will have to go back and redo it, because that was easier than actually trying to reconcile the changes. And the person doing this was a project manager, so they knew the scope of the project, and they knew that particular API was not part of the next deliverable, so they could afford to redo the work. And this is really vital to know, because redoing work is really expensive, and there was a lot of wasted effort. But because of, not so good communication and the way the changes were made, it was just easier just to go back and redo the work. So yeah, so for conclusions, basically we found that participants faced difficulties attempting to locate the necessary information. They had difficulties attempting to implement different potential solutions, and the information required is spread across many artifacts. And of course, this work is funded by NSF, and we are deeply grateful to our participants, without which this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you very much.